Good morning, students. This lesson is of class ninth for the subject of physical education. Topic Types of joints, which is covered in chapter 1, the human anatomy and physiology, starting on page number 9 of your textbook titled Health, Physical Education and Sports, and is being submitted to you 3rd May 2021. This voice is of Ms. Kusum. If all students are ready, then let us start with the topic joints, types of joints. All of you, please listen carefully as I will be asking a few questions in between the chapter. Joints. The adult human body has 206 bones, and with exceptions of hyoid bone in the neck, each bone is connected to at least one other bone. Joints are Joints are location where bones come together. Many joints allow for movement between the bones. The bones of other joints may be joined to each other by connective tissue or cartilage. These joints are designed by stability and provide for little or no movement. Joint stability and movement are related to each other. This means that stable joints allow for little or no mobility between the adjacent bones. The articulating surfaces of bones are stable types of joints with little or no mobility are strongly united to each other. For example, most of the joints of the skull are held together by fibrous connective tissue and do not allow for movement between the adjacent bones. A joint, also called an articulation, in any place where adjacent bones or bone and cartilage come together to form a connection. Joints are classified both structurally and functionally. Structural classification of joints take into account whether the adjacent bones are strongly enhanced to each other by fibrous connective tissue or cartilage, whether the adjacent bones articulate with each other with a fluid space called a joint cavity. Functional classification describes the degree of movement available between the bones, ranging from immobile to slightly mobile to freely movable joints. The amount of movement available at a particular joint of the body is related to the functional requirements for that joint. Thus, immobile or slightly movable joints are serve to protect internal organs, give stability to the body, and allow for limited body movement. In contrast, freely movable joints allow for much more extensive movement for the body and limbs. Structural classification of joints. The structural classification of joints is based on whether the articulating surfaces contact each other within a fluid filled joint cavity. Joints. A joint is the union of two or more bones of the skeletal. Bones are joined to each other by ligaments. The study of joints is called arthrology. Classification of joints. According to the mobility of joints, they can be classified into the following category. First, fibrous or immovable joints. Second, slightly movable and cartilaginous joints. Third, freely movable and synovial joint. Explanation of these joints. Fibrous or immovable joints. These joints are called immovable joints because they are fixed. There is no movement between the concerned bones. These joints are also called fibrous joints because the bones are connected by fibrous tissue. These joints are found in the bone of skull and face. Second, slightly movable and cartilaginous joints. In these joints, surfaces of the bones are separated by a pad of white fiber cartilage, and only slight movement is possible. Example of slightly movable joints are pubic symphysis of pubis and the joints between vertebrae. Third, freely movable joint. Freely movable or synovial joint. These joints are also called synovial joints. These joints include most of the joint of the body. The adjacent ends of the bones are covered with the hyaline cartilage and are surrounded by fibrous articular capsule, which is strengthened by ligament. Tendons of muscles pass over these joints. The hyaline cartilage provide a smooth surface for the opposing bones, lubricated by synovial fluid. The freely movable joints are further classified into 6 categories. So, this is the diagram of immovable joint, and this is slightly movable joint. This is the hip bone and this is the skull. So this is the diagram of freely movable joints, where saddle joint, carpal's joint, gliding joints, and further six types of freely movable joints. First, gliding joint. These joints permit gliding movement only in these joints. The articular surface glide over each other. These joints are found in between the tarsal bones of the ankle and between carpal bones of the wrist. Hinge joint. These joints permit angular movement in one direction like a door on his hinge. The movements of these joints are called flexion and extension. Flexion and extension in the elbow joint, humerus and ulna in the knee and in the joints of phalanges. Diagram of hinge joint, which is found in the hand, and hinge joint, gliding joints. Condylant joints. These joints allow an angular movement in two directions. For example, wrist joint. Movement of this joint include flexion, extension, adduction, abduction and circumduction, but no rotation. Fourth, saddle joint. These joints permit a great freedom of movements. Joint of thumb. It is enable the thumb to oppose the fingers. Ball and socket joint. These joints have an angular movement in all directions and a pivot movement. In this form of joint, a more or less rounded head lies in cup-like cavity. Shoulder joint and hip joint are examples of ball and socket joints. Pivot joints. These joints with a rotatory movement in one axis. In this form, a ring rotates around a pivot, or a pivot-like process rotates within a ring being formed of bone and cartilage. For example, the movement of head where the ring like atlas rotates round the peg-shaped process of the axis. Students, before going further in this chapter, let me ask you a few questions. You may kindly listen to the questions carefully and pause the audio for 3 minutes and write down the answers in your notebook. The questions are further. The questions and answer of this chapter are unit are enclosed with assignment PDF for your reference and will not be recorded in the video lesson. So this is the diagram of skeletal systems. Students, you will write above all question and answers in your notebook, and that's all for now. now. Thank you, students.